Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, I had the opportunity over the last day, and maybe some of you have as well, to watch the interview, the discussion that took place between Tucker Carlson and Piers Morgan. Now, within about 10 minutes of watching this interview, and essentially the initial part of the interview, the conversation that took place was about the ongoing war between Russia, NATO, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, what's interesting is it was very clear that, at least on the surface, Piers Morgan has a better sense of history in terms of things that have occurred, and he used that knowledge of history against Tucker Carlson, because again, it was clear that Tucker is just not as astute in terms of current and past events as Piers Morgan. So it was interesting to see that, and it would be interesting to see, for instance, if I had the opportunity to have the same discussion with Piers Morgan. And they had talked about one of the big issues that came up was Crimea, and at least on the surface, the whole concept of what occurred in terms of how the Russian Federation took control of the Crimea was a bit lost on Tucker Carlson, whereas he believes that an election took place. An election did take place. And ultimately, the people of Crimea do want to be part of the Russian Federation. They don't want to be part of this Ukrainian borderland entity that exists. We know this. We know this for certain. Now, Piers Morgan kept going on about the idea, the concept that the Ukraine is this sovereign beacon of democracy. And look, we know that not to be the case. We know there was Western intervention through its intelligence services to stage, and I don't like to use the term coup or coup d'etat unless it is an actual coup d'etat. And an actual coup d'etat is when there is a action by the military to take over a nation state. Now, that nation state could be democratic, it may not be democratic, but a coup is centered around a military operation by the military or elements of the military to seize control of a nation state. Now, that did not happen in the Ukraine. It was done differently. The takeover by the West of the Ukraine was done in a manner similar in which we have seen this blueprint done before. That happened. No one can debate that. Okay? The concept of these quote-unquote color revolutions are Central Intelligence Agency Playbook 101. It's what they do. Now, what Tucker Carlson didn't do is shape the narrative in terms of the Russian perception. And the only way to do that, the only way to shape that narrative is to give an example let's say, here in the United States, of something that could happen, and then try to explain it using that methodology. And I've done this before. I'm going to do it again right now. So, again, the majority of the people in the Ukraine speak Russian. It is probably, if not, well, I'm not going to say it is probably, it is, of all the former Soviet republics, okay? And you have many. You have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. So out of all of those republics, the Ukraine was probably the most Russian. It is Russian. It would be argued, it could be argued, that Kiev is more Russian than, quote-unquote, Ukrainian. Again, Ukrainian, you have to go way out here into the west. Lviv, the borders of Poland and Slovakia. That is the Ukrainians, an actual minority within a Russian majority of the Ukraine, the borderlands. Now let's try to explain something similar that could happen here in say, the United States, that would give you, the viewer, the perception of what has happened between Russia, the Ukraine, and the West. Let's pretend, for instance, back in the 1980s, okay, this is just hypothetical, but we have to go this route to kind of give you an idea of what this means to Russia. We're going to go to the United States, and we're going to pretend for a minute that the Cold War was won by the Soviet Union. The American economy, the United States economy, has collapsed. It has collapsed. Mexico has become a communist state. It has joined the Warsaw Pact. We have observed a great expansion of the Warsaw Pact. In this hypothetical scenario, this alternate universe in which the Soviet Union wins the Cold War. Okay? Now, as the United States economy collapses, there is a pull by the Mexican government and Mexicans living in Texas to have Texas removed from the United States. So in this scenario, Texas is removed from the United States. And I know you're saying, well, this is just craziness. That would never happen. Right? Well, for some in the Soviet Union, no one would have ever believed that the Ukraine would, one, become an independent state, and then two, join or attempt to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we have this separation of Texas. Texas has decided to pull out of the quote-unquote United States. The United States economy has collapsed. The dollar has collapsed. Hyperinflation has taken effect, and Texas has pulled out of the United States. Now, a few years after this event, due to pressure and intelligence activity by both the now very powerful Soviet Union and the Communist Republic of Mexico, who again is part of the Warsaw Pact, there is now multiple Soviet divisions based inside of Mexico. The Soviets have installed theater anti-ballistic missile systems inside of Mexico. And now there was a referendum in which Mexican forces, along with Soviet advisors, have now moved into Texas. And now the Soviet Union is looking to deploy armored units in what was formerly known as Fort Hood, Texas. Now look, I know your head's spinning right now, and you're probably saying, oh, that's insane, that's crazy, that would never happen, that could never happen. Maybe not, and it didn't, because to the victor the spoils. Okay, the United States won the Cold War. But if it hadn't, and the Soviets would have won the Cold War, and I give you this hypothetical scenario in which we see Texas break away from the United States, and then becomes essentially part of this Soviet international alliance. What would we do? What would you think? Well, obviously, you would have a problem with it. And in all likelihood, the powers that be in the United States, especially if the economy was turning around inside the United States after this post-collapse, they would probably go to war over it. They would not allow Texas to become part of this Mexican-Soviet alliance. And that is what has happened in the Ukraine. Very similar. Very, very similar scenario. The Ukraine, very large republic, Soviet republic. But again, because of that period of time within the Soviet Union, these borders are artificial, okay? Especially what exists from Kiev east, what exists in terms of the Ukraine owning Odessa, okay? Odessa, Sevastopol, Kharkov, Donetsk, Luhansk. These places are very much Russian, are more Russian, Kiev, more Russian than in fact, quote unquote, Ukrainian. And that's the perspective you have to take to try and understand the Russian perception around this issue. And again, I know as I talk about the Soviets winning the Cold War, I know when I talk about Texas removing itself from the United States, becoming independent, and then joining with Mexico and the Soviet Union, I know that seems outlandish. I know that's hard to kind of get your head around. But that is what happened. That is what happened. And it's even more nuanced than that in terms of how the North Atlantic Treaty Organization expanded. You know, there was a lot of conversations that took place in the early 80s and going into the and then finally, late 80s going into the early 90s, in which NATO had given us assurances that it would not expand east. Now, that had a disarming effect. These assurances essentially placated many individuals in the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, Russia, the Soviets, that would have taken a more hardline role in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I've talked about this before. If we could go back in history into the late 80s and we could show those Soviet leaders what would have happened or what was going to happen, I think history would have turned out differently. I don't think we would have seen some of the allowances that occurred in terms of allowing some of the things to happen that actually happened. But again, that's kind of where we're at right now. The Ukraine is essentially the American version of Texas that has succeeded and essentially joined the Warsaw Pact with the help of maybe ethnic Mexicans living in Texas. Again, a little fantastical. Well, I would say very, very much so. But that's the best scenario that I can give you where you can try and understand, again, this Russian perception. So think about it, right? If Ukraine is to Russia what Texas is to the United States, what would the United States be willing to do? Would the United States just simply be happy with saying, okay, we're going to move in and we're just going to seize Dallas and Amarillo? Mexico, Soviets, you get the rest. No. That's not the way that's going to go down. It's not. And thus, you have what is happening right now in terms of this very much a bloody war that has taken place. And unfortunately, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is essentially creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. By its expanding east into the former Soviet sphere of influence and definitely into the Russian sphere of influence, and the next step is an attempt to possibly break up the Russian Federation, the only outcome, if that is the political goal of NATO, and it appears to be that goal, is the endgame, is the breakup of the Russian Federation. What is going to be the Russian response? It's not going to be a political response. There can't be a political response to that. The Russians tried a political response to the Ukraine, and that was disallowed. That was it. That was the last line for the Russians. That was the political response. And it was disallowed by NATO, and thus we're in this conflict. And at this point, looking at it from the Russian perception, it's difficult for me to think that the Russians would allow any entity in terms of the Ukraine to exist. Maybe a small rump state in the West at a certain point. But I would have to say, if I was the leader of the Russian Federation, my war goal, my aim, would be to eventually, either through a plebiscite or process in which you could achieve victory through the majority of the population overthrowing one side that desires to be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or a military outcome. And right now you're seeing the military outcome play out. And I think at this point, the Russians, more likely than not, have decided that it probably needs to take control of all of, or at least most of, the Ukraine. Again, because what's next? What comes after the Ukraine? There is no reason to believe, if you are a Russian, there's no reasonable reason to believe that NATO will stop expanding. And I don't believe NATO can stop expanding. So again, what next? And that what next after the Ukraine is what concerns the Russians. Thus, this endgame has to be victory for the Russians. And I think that's the way it's going to go. And I think, unfortunately, right now, we're on a track for global war. As always, thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.